Maya Williams wasn't your typical 12-year-old. While most kids spent their weekends glued to video games or hanging out at the mall, Maya had a dream and a plan. Every Saturday, she set up her little lemonade stand on the corner of Willow Street, right outside her grandmother's house. It wasn't much, just a foldable table, a bright yellow tablecloth, and a sign she'd painted herself with big, bubbly letters, Maya's famous lemonade, only 50 cents. Her lemonade was special, and people in the neighborhood knew it. It wasn't just the sweetness of the drink or the perfect balance of tartness. Maya added a secret ingredient, something her late mother had taught her. She called it a pinch of love, and while she wouldn't tell anyone exactly what that meant, her loyal customers swore they could taste it. To Maya, this stand was more than a way to make pocket money. It was her way of honoring her mother's memory, of proving to herself and maybe even the world that she could create something meaningful. Each time she sold a cup, she felt a small spark of joy. She was building something, one cup at a time. That Saturday morning, the sun was already blazing, but Maya didn't mind. She loved the summer heat, it brought more people outside, more thirsty customers. She wore her favorite yellow dress, one she thought matched the cheerful theme of her stand, and carried a large pitcher filled to the brim with her signature lemonade. "Mama, do you think I'll need more cups today?" she asked her grandmother, who sat on the porch with a knowing smile. "Baby, with how good your lemonade is, you might need more than just cups. You're going to need a whole factory," Grandma laughed, waving her hand. Maya giggled, her heart swelling with pride. "Maybe one day," she said, half joking but half dreaming. By mid-morning, customers were lining up. Neighbors stopped by with their dogs, kids ran over with quarters clinking in their pockets, and even the mailman made it a habit to grab a cup on his route. Maya greeted each one with a bright smile, thanking them warmly as they complimented her lemonade. But as the day wore on, Maya noticed something strange. Across the street, a police car had pulled up and parked under the shade of an old oak tree. At first, she didn't think much of it. The officers often stopped in the neighborhood, sometimes to chat with residents or take a break. But this time felt different. The car didn't leave. Instead, one of the officers sat inside, watching her stand from afar. Maya tried to shake off the unease bubbling inside her. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Maybe he's just keeping an eye on the street." Maya's biggest worry that morning had been whether she'd have enough sugar to get through the day. But by the afternoon, she'd be facing something much harder than an empty pitcher. The police car door finally swung open, and a tall, stern-faced officer stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his sunglasses reflecting the sunlight as he walked purposefully toward her. Maya froze for a moment, her hands tightening around the handle of her pitcher. "Is there a problem, sir?" Grandma called from the porch, her voice steady but tinged with concern. The officer ignored her, stopping directly in front of Maya's stand. His shadow loomed over her, and for the first time that day, Maya felt small not just in size, but in a way that cut deeper. "Do you have a permit for this?" he asked, his tone sharp and authoritative. Maya blinked, confused. "A permit," she repeated. She'd heard the word before but didn't fully understand what it meant. "For this business," the officer clarified, gesturing at her lemonade stand as if it were some elaborate operation. "You can't sell drinks here without proper permission." "But, it's just lemonade," Maya said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer's expression didn't soften. "Rules are rules," he replied curtly. "I'm going to need you to pack this up." The neighborhood, which had been bustling with life just moments ago, seemed to grow eerily quiet. People stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting between Maya and the officer. Some whispered to each other, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. A few tried to step closer, but the officer's commanding presence kept them at bay. Maya looked up at him, her chest tightening. She wasn't a troublemaker. She'd never broken a rule in her life. All she wanted was to sell lemonade, something she thought made people happy. Her hands shook as she started to reach for her cups, but a voice stopped her. "Hold on a minute," Grandma said, standing up from her chair. She walked down the porch steps, her cane tapping against the pavement with each deliberate step. "This is nonsense," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto the officers. "She's just a child selling lemonade. She's not hurting anyone." "It's the law, ma'am," the officer replied, though his tone wavered slightly under Grandma's glare. "If she doesn't have a permit, she can't operate." "Operate?" Grandma repeated, her voice rising. "She's not running some big business. She's a little girl trying to do something positive. Maybe you should spend your time going after real problems instead of picking on children." Maya looked down, tears welling in her eyes. She felt embarrassed, humiliated even. The lemonade stand that had once made her so proud now felt like a mistake. As the confrontation unfolded, more neighbors began to gather. Phones were pulled out, cameras rolling. "This isn't right," someone murmured. "She's just a kid." "Leave her alone," another voice called out. The officer, clearly aware of the growing crowd, hesitated. But instead of backing down, he reached for his notepad. "I'm issuing a citation," he said, his voice clipped. "This is an unauthorized business." Maya's heart sank as she watched him scribble on the pad. The small glimmer of hope she'd had that this might all blow over was snuffed out. From across the street, a car pulled up, its engine rumbling to a stop. Maya didn't notice at first, her eyes glued to the officer's hands as he ripped the ticket from his pad. But the sound of a deep, familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" The crowd turned, parting slightly to reveal a towering figure stepping out of the car. Maya's eyes widened as recognition dawned on her. It was Shaquille O'Neal. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal strode confidently toward the scene. Dressed casually in a loose-fitting polo shirt and jeans, his presence was undeniable. He wasn't just any bystander, he was a living legend, a man who could command attention without saying a word. Yet, in this moment, Shaq wasn't focused on being a celebrity. His eyes were fixed on Maya and the officer standing over her. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq repeated, his deep voice carrying an edge of calm authority. The officer turned, startled by the sudden arrival of someone so visibly out of the ordinary. He adjusted his sunglasses, trying to maintain his composure despite the now undeniable pressure of the crowd and Shaq himself. "This young lady is operating an unauthorized business," the officer said stiffly, holding up the citation. "She doesn't have a permit." Shaq raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the small lemonade stand. He took in the bright yellow sign, the neatly stacked cups, and finally, Maya's tear-streaked face. His expression softened as he crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "Hey there, little one," he said gently, his tone completely different from the one he'd used with the officer. "What's your name?" Maya sniffled, her voice trembling. Maya." "Well, Maya, this looks like the best lemonade stand I've ever seen," Shaq said with a warm smile. "I bet your lemonade tastes amazing." Maya nodded slowly, her hands gripping the edges of the table. "It does," she whispered. Shaq straightened up, turning back to the officer. The warmth in his expression faded, replaced by a seriousness that made the tension in the air almost palpable. "Let me get this straight," Shaq said, his voice steady but firm. "You're shutting down a lemonade stand run by a 12-year-old girl? Over a permit?" The officer shifted uncomfortably under Shaq's gaze, his earlier confidence faltering. "It's not personal," he muttered. "It's just the law." Shaq crossed his arms, his towering frame making the officer seem smaller by the second. "The law, huh?" he said, his tone laced with quiet disbelief. I've seen a lot of things in my life, but this takes the cake. Or should I say, the lemonade. The crowd, emboldened by Shaq's presence, began to speak up more boldly. She's just a kid, a woman called out. How can you justify this? Yeah, this isn't right, a man added, his voice echoing the growing sentiment. Even Maya's grandmother, who had initially tried to keep her composure, chimed in. This girl is doing something good for herself and this community, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Instead of encouraging her, you're trying to tear her down. The officer looked around, clearly outnumbered and outmatched. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. The rules exist for a reason, he said defensively. If we let this go, what's next? Everyone setting up shop wherever they want. Shaq chuckled dryly, though there was no humor in the sound. You know what I see, he said, his voice louder now so the entire crowd could hear. I see a young girl with ambition, trying to make something of herself. I see a community that's proud of her. And I see an officer who's forgotten what his badge is supposed to stand for. Maya watched the scene unfold, her emotions swirling. She felt a mix of gratitude and awe toward Shaq, but there was still a lingering fear in the pit of her stomach. Would this really end in her favor, or would she still be forced to shut down? Shaq seemed to sense her unease. He turned back to her, crouching again so they were eye level. Maya, he said softly, do you know why I came here today? She shook her head, her wide eyes reflecting her confusion. I saw your story online, Shaq explained. A lot of people did. And you know what? They're all on your side. They believe in you, just like I do. So don't let this guy or anyone else make you feel small. You're doing something amazing. Maya's lips quivered, but this time, it wasn't from fear. A small smile broke through, and she nodded, her confidence beginning to return. The officer, sensing that the situation was slipping further out of his control, tried one last time to assert his authority. Look, this isn't up for debate, he said, his voice rising slightly. If she doesn't have a permit, she can't operate. Shaq straightened up again, his expression hardening. You're right about one thing, he said. This isn't up for debate. But you know what is? How we treat the people in our community. Especially the ones trying to do something good. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming. How many of you think Maya needs to shut this stand down? Not a single hand went up. Instead, there were shouts of support. Keep it open, someone yelled. Let her sell her lemonade, another voice called out. Shaq looked back at the officer, his point made. Looks like the people have spoken, he said simply. At that moment, a car pulled up at the edge of the crowd. A woman stepped out, dressed in a crisp business suit and carrying a clipboard. Excuse me, she called, making her way through the throng of onlookers. I'm from the mayor's office. The officer stiffened, his face turning a shade paler. The mayor's office, he repeated, clearly caught off guard. Yes, the woman said, her tone brisk. We received numerous calls about this situation. I came to see it for myself. She looked around, taking in the scene before her eyes landed on Maya. Her expression softened immediately. You must be Maya, she said kindly. I've heard a lot about you. It's not every day that a young entrepreneur becomes the talk of the town. Maya nodded shyly, unsure of what to say. The woman turned to the officer, her demeanor shifting back to one of authority. Officer Daniels, this young lady is not breaking any laws, she said firmly. The city's regulations on permits for lemonade stands only apply to commercial businesses, not small neighborhood setups like this one. You've overstepped your bounds. The crowd erupted in applause, and Maya's grandmother let out a triumphant hallelujah. Shaq, smiling broadly now, clapped his hands together. There you have it, he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. Maya's stand stays open. The officer, clearly out of options, muttered something under his breath before walking back to his car. As he drove away, the crowd cheered louder, their voices ringing with victory. But Shaq wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. "Maya," he said, stepping up to the stand, "I think I'll take a cup of lemonade. And you know what? Keep the change." He handed her a crisp $100 bill, and Maya's eyes widened in shock. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill," she stammered, overwhelmed. Shaq winked. "Don't thank me. Just keep being awesome." The scene turned into a celebration. Neighbors lined up for lemonade, Shaq posed for pictures, and Maya felt like the happiest girl in the world. The stand that had started as her small dream now symbolized something so much bigger: hope, resilience, and the power of community. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the street, Maya looked up at Shaq and said, "One day, I'm going to have my own lemonade company." Shaq grinned. "You better invite me to the grand opening." Maya nodded, her heart full. "I will. I promise." And in that moment, the world felt just a little brighter. The day had started out like any other for Maya. The sun was high, the air was warm, and her lemonade stand was thriving. She had greeted every customer with her usual bright smile, the kind that could light up even the cloudiest of days. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to change. It started with the low hum of an approaching engine. Maya didn't pay much attention at first, cars passed by her stand all the time. But when the sound grew louder and stopped abruptly with the screech of brakes, she glanced up. A patrol car sat parked across the street, its glossy black exterior reflecting the sunlight. The door opened, and out stepped Officer Daniels. Officer Daniels was a man people in the neighborhood knew well, and not in a good way. His reputation preceded him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always with a pair of mirrored sunglasses perched on his nose, he carried himself with a sternness that bordered on intimidation. For as long as Maya could remember, he had patrolled the streets with an eagle eye, always on the lookout for anything or anyone he deemed out of place. Today, that someone was Maya. He walked toward her stand with deliberate, heavy steps, the soles of his polished boots clicking against the pavement. Maya froze, her hands still holding the lemonade pitcher she'd been about to pour. Her heart began to race, though she didn't know why. She hadn't done anything wrong. The officer stopped in front of her stand, towering over the small table. He tilted his head slightly, peering at her through his mirrored lenses. "Do you have a permit for this?" he asked, his voice sharp and cold. Maya blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "A permit," she repeated, her voice tinged with confusion. "Yes, a permit," Daniels said, his tone growing impatient. "You can't just set up shop wherever you please. There are rules, little girl." Maya swallowed hard, her hands tightening around the pitcher. "But, it's just lemonade," she said softly. "I'm not hurting anyone." The officer's lips curled into a faint smirk, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Rules are rules," he said flatly. "You need permission to run a business, even a lemonade stand." The injustice of his words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. She wasn't running some big operation. She was just trying to do something she loved, something that made people happy. But Daniels didn't seem to care. He looked at her stand as though it were a crime scene, his eyes scanning the table, the sign, and the cups stacked neatly in rows. "Pack it up," he said, crossing his arms. "Now." Maya's smile, the one she'd worn all day, faltered completely. Her chest tightened as she realized he wasn't joking. She looked around, hoping someone might step in, but the street had gone eerily quiet. A few neighbors stood on their porches, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other, their faces etched with disbelief. Others simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. "Sir, please," Maya said, her voice trembling. "I just want to sell lemonade. I'm saving up for something important." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "I don't care what you're saving for," he said. "What you're doing is against the law." From the porch, Grandma had been watching the entire interaction, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. She stood slowly, leaning on her cane as she made her way down the steps. "Officer," she called out, her voice steady but firm, "what's the meaning of this?" Daniels turned to face her, his demeanor unchanged. "Ma'am, your granddaughter is operating an unauthorized business. She needs to shut it down." Grandma narrowed her eyes, her posture as strong as her voice. "She's a child selling lemonade," she said pointedly. "She's not running a corporation. What harm is she doing?" "That's not the point," Daniels replied, though his tone wavered slightly under Grandma's intense gaze. "If we let this slide, what kind of example are we setting?" Grandma scoffed, shaking her head. "The only example you're setting right now is that bullying a little girl is somehow acceptable. Shame on you." But Daniels wasn't backing down. He pulled out a notepad from his pocket, clicking his pen with a sharp snap. "I'm issuing a citation," he said, scribbling furiously on the paper. "If the stand isn't gone by the end of the day, there will be further consequences." Maya felt her eyes sting with tears as she watched him write. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she thought about grabbing her things and running. But where would she go? This was her corner, her stand. It was supposed to be a place of joy, not fear. As Daniels tore the citation from his pad and handed it to her, the weight of the moment crashed down on her. It wasn't just about lemonade anymore. It was about the unfairness of it all, the feeling that she was being singled out for something so small, so harmless. The neighbors began to murmur more loudly, their whispers turning into words of frustration and disbelief. "This isn't right," someone said. "She's just a kid." "Leave her alone," another voice shouted, though they stayed at a distance. Daniels turned his head slightly, clearly aware of the growing tension. But instead of retreating, he dug in his heels. "I'm just doing my job," he said, though the words sounded less certain now. Maya stood there, clutching the citation in her hand, her knuckles white. Her grandmother placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, whispering words of encouragement. But nothing could take away the sting of humiliation Maya felt. As Daniels returned to his patrol car, the crowd that had gathered began to close in around Maya's stand. Some offered words of support, while others shook their heads in anger. "This isn't over," Grandma said softly, her voice full of determination. "We're not going to let him win." But for Maya, the damage had already been done. Her stand, the one thing that had brought her so much pride and happiness, now felt like a target. She looked at the bright yellow sign she'd painted with so much care, and for the first time, it didn't make her smile. She looked up at her grandmother, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Grandma's eyes gleamed with a fierceness Maya hadn't seen before. "We stand our ground," she said firmly. "And we remind this town and that officer what you're made of." Maya nodded slowly, a small spark of hope flickering in her chest. She didn't know how they were going to fight back, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to give up without a fight. Little did she know, help was closer than she could have imagined. The weight of the citation in Maya's hand felt like a stone, heavy and cold against her trembling fingers. She stared at it, the words blurring in her vision. "Unauthorized business," it read. "Failure to comply will result in fines or further legal action." She clenched her jaw, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill. This was supposed to be a good day. A day when she could stand proud in front of her friends, family, and neighbors, showing them that she was capable of doing something special. But now, it felt like her entire dream had been shattered with one cold, unfeeling sentence. As Officer Daniels climbed back into his patrol car, he didn't even look back at her. His eyes were hidden behind those reflective sunglasses, his face a mask of indifference. Maya watched as he pulled away, the tires screeching slightly against the pavement as if he were in a hurry to be done with this situation. But Maya wasn't done. The neighborhood around her was quiet for a moment, too quiet. The usual sounds, the distant hum of lawnmowers, the chirping of birds seemed muted in comparison to the stillness that followed Daniel's departure. A deep breath rattled through Maya's chest as the silence began to break. Slowly, neighbors began to approach, their eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Grandma stood beside her, the determination in her stance unwavering. "Don't worry, Maya," she murmured, her words steady, "we won't let him win. He might have a badge, but he doesn't have the heart to understand what you're doing here." Maya nodded, the sting of the officer's words still fresh, but Grandma's reassurance kept her grounded. It was only then that Maya realized just how many people had been watching. Neighbors who had been sitting on their porches, sipping their coffee or reading newspapers, now stood near her stand, murmuring their displeasure with the situation. A few had even walked closer, clearly on her side. "That officer's out of line," one man called out, shaking his head. "A kid trying to make something of herself, and he's acting like she's a criminal." "Exactly." A woman beside him chimed in. "There's nothing wrong with a little lemonade stand. Hell, we've all seen kids doing it. No harm in it." Maya's chest swelled a little with pride, hearing the support of her community. She had always known this was a good place, where people helped each other, but now it felt like they were all coming together in her corner. Grandma's voice was low, but powerful. "Maya, you've got something special here. This isn't just about lemonade. This is about people seeing you, hearing you, and respecting you. Don't let one bad day take away everything you've worked for." Maya looked at her grandmother, her heart warming at the strength in her voice. She had always admired how Grandma never backed down, no matter the odds. Today, it was her turn to stand firm, too. "I won't let him win," Maya said, her voice more confident now. "But, what do we do now?" Grandma smiled at her, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Well, we don't just roll over. We make a stand. If he wants to take that stand away from you, we'll make it loud enough that he'll have no choice but to listen." Maya's eyes widened with realization. "But how?" Grandma pointed down the street, towards the town's community center. "That's where the town council meets every month. We'll go there tomorrow. I've lived here long enough to know that people can be moved by the truth. You tell them what happened today, and you watch how quickly they start speaking out." Maya's pulse quickened. "You really think they'll listen?" "Absolutely," Grandma said, the surety in her voice never wavering. "You've got the truth on your side, and that's the best weapon you could have." The conversation took Maya's mind off the citation, but only for a moment. The reality of what had happened still lingered, and the anger in her chest refused to subside. She had worked hard to make this stand a success. She had designed the sign herself, painted it with bright yellow letters, and carefully mixed each batch of lemonade. And now, because of one officer's prejudice, everything was at risk. How could one person have so much power over her? It didn't seem fair, and it felt like the officer had used his authority to make her feel small, as if her dreams weren't worth anything. The thought churned in her stomach. She couldn't let him get away with this. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighbors were still gathering, some offering words of support, while others simply shook their heads, appalled by what they had just witnessed. Maya could sense a growing unease, as if everyone was wondering, is this really happening? "I've been thinking about this," said the man who had spoken earlier, the one who'd called Daniels out. I work for the town's local business association, and I've seen plenty of kids with lemonade stands. This isn't the first time. But it's the first time I've seen a cop act this way. Me too, a woman replied, frowning. It's ridiculous. And, quite frankly, it feels like bullying. Maya's ears perked up at the word. Bullying, she repeated to herself. Was that what this was? She'd been bullied for wanting to do something nice for the community. That was a bitter pill to swallow. A few moments later, a young man from the crowd stepped forward. He was in his 20s, wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie. He had a casual demeanor, but his eyes were filled with seriousness. Maya, I don't know what that officer was thinking, but I want you to know something, he said, stepping closer to her stand. You're not alone in this. I'm gonna post about this on social media, and I'll make sure people know what happened. This kind of thing should never happen to anyone, especially a kid like you. Maya's eyes widened. She had never thought about social media as a way to fight back. But in that moment, she realized just how much power it could give her. You think people will care? She asked, her voice hopeful but uncertain. Absolutely, he said, pulling out his phone. We'll make sure everyone knows. I've got friends who run local news pages, and they'll pick up on it. And you know what? We might even get the mayor involved. If that officer thinks he can push you around like that, he's got another thing coming. As the young man typed up his post, other neighbors gathered around, their voices growing louder, their words filled with anger at what had just transpired. Maya's lemonade stand, something that had once felt small and insignificant, now felt like a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right, no matter how big or small the battle seemed. Let's spread the word, Grandma said, nodding approvingly at the group that had gathered. If one person's voice is loud, it gets heard. But if enough of us speak, no one can ignore us. Maya's heart swelled with gratitude. She had felt so alone when Officer Daniels had come, as if her world had shrunk to nothing more than the small table and the officer's unyielding gaze. But now, as the voices of her neighbors filled the air, she realized something important: she was not alone. Not anymore. And they were going to make sure she wasn't silenced. The crowd was starting to disperse, but Maya remained at her stand, taking in the scene. Her stand wasn't just a table anymore. It was a battleground for fairness and equality. And with her neighbors rallying behind her, she realized that perhaps this little lemonade stand was about to make more of an impact than she could have ever imagined. She looked up at Grandma, a determined look in her eyes. I'm ready, she said firmly. Grandma smiled, her eyes twinkling. Good. Let's show them what we're made of. The tension from the encounter with Officer Daniels didn't dissipate quickly. If anything, it only grew stronger as the hours passed. Word spread like wildfire through the town faster than Maya could have ever imagined. Her once quiet little lemonade stand had become a flashpoint for injustice. The small suburban community that had once seemed so peaceful was now stirred with a collective sense of unfairness. Neighbors who had once watched from their porches now walked the streets with their phones out, tapping away, posting about what had happened. The community had always been tight-knit, but now it felt like they were bound by something much bigger than just familiarity. They were united by a shared cause, a shared feeling of injustice. As the posts went viral on social media, Maya's lemonade stand became a symbol of resistance. Pictures of her stand, with the bright yellow sign, now filled the feeds of people across the town and beyond. The hashtags were everywhere. Hashtag Maya Lemonade Stand, hashtag Justice for Maya, and hashtag Lemonade is not a crime. What started as a small act of rebellion against one officer's unfair treatment was snowballing into something much larger than anyone could have expected. But while the town was caught up in the outrage, something else was happening behind the scenes. Maya didn't know it yet, but just one post was about to change everything. It wasn't from a journalist or an activist, those voices had come and gone. No, this post came from someone who could give Maya's story the attention it needed, someone whose reach went far beyond the walls of this small town. It came from none other than Shaquille O'Neal, the retired NBA legend, whose words and actions carried weight all over the world. "Not on my watch," he wrote, his message simple but powerful. Attached to the post was a photo of Maya's lemonade stand, the handwritten sign proudly displayed. Shaq's towering presence loomed over the post, a promise that something was about to change. But no one knew exactly what. The post spread like wildfire. The media picked up on it almost immediately. Headlines blared, "Shaquille O'Neal stands with young entrepreneur facing unfair treatment." As the post went viral, Maya was still sitting at her stand, her hands clenched tightly around the small, cold cup she had been absent-mindedly holding. Her thoughts were racing, but she tried to keep calm. The post from Shaq had made her feel a flicker of hope, but it also filled her with questions. She had no idea why Shaquille O'Neal, a man she only knew from basketball highlights on TV, would be involved in something like this. What did he want with her lemonade stand? Grandma sat beside her, her old eyes now fixed on her granddaughter's face. The news had started buzzing, the same way it had earlier with the neighbors, but now it was different. The world seemed to be listening. And Maya could feel it, the weight of everything shifting. "He's really standing with you, huh?" Grandma said, her voice thick with disbelief and admiration. Maya nodded, still in a daze. "Yeah, but why? What's he doing here?" "Well, that's a question," Grandma said thoughtfully. "Shaq's got a lot of influence. And a lot of power. If he's posting about this, he sees something worth fighting for. And people will listen to him." Maya looked at her grandmother, her mind racing. "But what can he do? I'm just a kid selling lemonade. Why would he care?" Grandma chuckled softly, her voice filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of experience. "Sometimes, Maya, people like Shaq see things differently. He knows what it's like to fight for what's right. And he knows how to make a loud noise when he needs to. I think he's about to do just that." While Maya tried to process everything, Officer Daniels was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. He had gone about his day like it was just another routine matter. He had issued a citation, made his rounds, and moved on with his duties. But what he didn't realize was that he had sparked a fire, one that was spreading far beyond what he could have anticipated. Behind the scenes, Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just posting online. His involvement went far deeper than just words on a screen. The retired NBA superstar had connections, resources, and influence that were far-reaching. He was not someone who simply sat behind a screen and made posts. He was the type of person who used his platform to bring about change. And he had already begun making moves. Shaq made a few calls. One of those calls was to an old friend of his, a prominent civil rights lawyer named Lisa Harper. Lisa had made a name for herself over the years by taking on cases that others wouldn't touch. She had a reputation for standing up against injustice, no matter the scale, and Shaq knew that if anyone could help Maya, it was her. Lisa Harper listened carefully as Shaq described the situation. He told her about the unfair treatment of a young girl just trying to sell lemonade. He talked about Officer Daniels, who seemed more interested in making an example out of a child than actually upholding the law. And he told her about the viral post, the outrage spreading through social media. "Shaq, this is bigger than just a lemonade stand," Lisa said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You've done the right thing bringing this to my attention. I'll get on this immediately." Shaq hung up the phone with a sigh of relief. He knew that Lisa would handle the legal side, and now it was just a matter of letting the world know that Maya's voice, her small, but powerful, voice, was being heard. Back in town, the media was starting to swarm. News stations sent reporters, some with cameras, others just with notebooks. They were trying to piece together the story, to find out who Maya was, and why this had become such a big deal. They had never expected a small lemonade stand to catch national attention. But then again, they had never expected Shaquille O'Neal to get involved either. Maya's stand was now a beacon. People from nearby towns started to show up, wanting to buy lemonade, wanting to show their support. A crowd began to gather, a mix of people who just wanted to be a part of the movement, and those who had genuinely been inspired by the young girl's courage. Maya wasn't sure what to think of all the attention. On the one hand, she felt like she was finally being heard. On the other, it was overwhelming. She had never planned for any of this. All she had wanted was to sell lemonade on a sunny day, but now, everything had changed. As the crowd grew larger, a new thought started to form in her mind. Maybe this wasn't just about standing up to Officer Daniels. Maybe this was bigger. Maybe it was about showing everyone that a little girl, with nothing but a lemonade stand and a dream, could make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, Shaquille O'Neal's involvement wasn't just about him standing up for her, it was about something far more powerful, the belief that no one, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, should ever be silenced. Back at the police station, Officer Daniels sat in his chair, unaware of the storm he had unleashed. He had seen all the posts, the comments, the outrage, but he hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions. He was just doing his job, right? Maya had no permit. She was breaking the rules. What he didn't know was that the very rules he thought he was upholding were being questioned, not by angry neighbors or online trolls, but by someone far more powerful. Someone who knew exactly what it meant to challenge authority, to stand up for what was right, no matter who was watching. And Officer Daniels? He was about to learn the hard way that when you mess with the wrong person, you don't just face the consequences, you face the entire weight of the truth. At the same time, Officer Daniels found himself in a position he had never been in before. He had been a police officer for over 15 years, and in all that time, he had never once questioned his role or the power that came with his badge. He followed the rules, and those who didn't follow the rules were dealt with, simple as that. But this situation? It was anything but simple. Daniels had received a series of phone calls over the past few days, each one more urgent and critical than the last. Local media outlets had been calling, asking for comment, but he refused to speak to them. He was steadfast in his belief that he had done nothing wrong. He had acted in the best interest of the community, enforcing the law as he was supposed to. But then came the phone call that truly shook him. It was from his chief, a man Daniels had known for years. The chief was usually calm, composed, but today his voice was clipped, his tone sharp. "Daniels, we've got a situation on our hands," the chief said. "You've seen the posts, right?" Daniels grunted in acknowledgement. "Yeah. Social media's blowing up about the lemonade stand." "Not just that," the chief continued. "It's getting nationwide attention. Shaquille O'Neal posted about it?" "That's right, Shaq." The name hit Daniels like a thunderclap. Shaquille O'Neal was more than just a basketball player. He was a global icon, a man with millions of fans, and his involvement in the situation made everything that much bigger. The news outlets had started to focus more on Shaq's support for Maya than the incident itself. "Chief, I'm just doing my job. The girl didn't have a permit, and I did what was required of me." "You think that's what this is about?" The chief's voice dropped, and Daniels could hear the frustration in his words. "It's not about the permit. It's about how you treated her. The whole town is talking about it. The media's painting this as a story of a little girl being oppressed by a police officer over something that's just lemonade." Daniels felt a knot in his stomach. He had always seen himself as a protector of the people. He believed in upholding the law, but now the law seemed irrelevant. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions had come off as heavy-handed. Maybe he hadn't been as fair as he thought. "Look," the chief continued, "I'm not saying you did anything illegal. But this is bigger than you now. The department's under pressure. You need to lay low for a while. Let things cool off." Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on doing things by the book. But now, it felt like everything he had worked for was coming apart at the seams. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being painted as the villain in this story, a story he never intended to be part of. Meanwhile, Maya was oblivious to the turmoil swirling around Officer Daniels. For her, the world had shifted, but it was still full of questions. Why had Shaquille O'Neal gotten involved? Why was he doing all of this? It was clear that something was about to happen, but what? She didn't know. All she could do was sit back and wait. The next day, Maya received a call that would change everything. It was from Lisa Harper, the civil rights attorney who Shaquille O'Neal had put in touch with her. Maya was nervous when she picked up the phone. She wasn't used to receiving calls from lawyers, especially not ones representing big names like Shaq. "Hello, is this Maya Williams?" Lisa's voice was calm and reassuring, and it immediately put Maya at ease. "Yes, this is Maya," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Maya, I'm Lisa Harper. I've been following your story, and I have to say, you're incredibly brave for standing up like you did. I know this situation has been overwhelming, but I want you to know that we're here to help." Maya swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Help? How? What can you do?" "Well, I've been in touch with Shaquille O'Neal," Lisa said. "And we're putting together a plan. We're going to make sure your story is heard, and that Officer Daniels understands the consequences of his actions." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? What consequences?" Lisa took a deep breath. "Maya, sometimes when people in power make mistakes, especially when they misuse that power, they need to be held accountable. This isn't just about you. This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen again. We're going to make sure that Officer Daniels learns a valuable lesson about how to treat people, especially kids, and especially when they're just trying to do something good." Maya felt a mixture of emotions: relief, fear, confusion. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this. Was she ready to go up against a police officer? Was she ready to be a symbol for something bigger than herself? "I don't know if I can do this," Maya whispered. Lisa's voice softened. "You don't have to do it alone, Maya. You have people who believe in you. You have people who are ready to fight for you. And that's exactly what we're going to do." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels, who had been trying to lay low, found that the storm was only getting worse. He had hoped things would blow over, that people would forget about the lemonade stand incident. But instead, the pressure was mounting. The calls kept coming. News outlets kept asking for interviews. And every time he turned on the TV, there was Shaquille O'Neal, speaking out for Maya, demanding justice. Daniels had tried to avoid the issue, but it was impossible. Everywhere he went, people were talking about it. They weren't talking about the law. They were talking about the little girl and the officer who had arrested her. They were talking about an injustice that had been done. Now, Daniels had to face the fact that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. The legal consequences were looming. The media attention wasn't going away. And as he sat in his office, he realized that he was not just facing public scrutiny, he was facing the consequences of his actions. As the days went by, it became clear that the story was taking on a life of its own. Maya's lemonade stand had sparked something much bigger than anyone expected. What had started as a small, seemingly insignificant act of selling lemonade had turned into a battle for justice. Maya didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: she had already won. She had shown the world that even the smallest voice could make a difference. And as more people joined her cause, as Shaquille O'Neal and Lisa Harper fought by her side, Maya realized that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stand up for what's right no matter how big or small you are. The morning of the big reveal was unlike any other for Maya. She had no idea what to expect, but the nervous energy in the air was undeniable. The week had been full of interviews, phone calls, and media attention that made her feel both overwhelmed and proud. She had become a symbol of resilience, a little girl with a big heart standing up for what was right. The pressure was starting to build. This wasn't just about lemonade anymore. This was about proving that the world could change if people just had the courage to stand up for themselves and each other. That Saturday, the weather was perfect for a lemonade stand, bright and sunny, with a cool breeze making the trees sway. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she set up her little table, positioning the pitcher of lemonade and the cups just so, making sure everything was perfect. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't alone. Shaquille O'Neal stood beside her, a towering figure whose presence commanded attention. The crowd that had gathered to support her was buzzing with excitement, cameras flashing, people chatting, and others eagerly awaiting the moment they had all been waiting for. It wasn't just about the lemonade stand anymore, it was about the movement Maya had sparked. The movement that proved that one person could stand up to authority and make waves. And Maya, at just 12 years old, was the one leading it. Shaq smiled down at Maya, his massive hands holding a gold-stamped permit. It glinted in the sunlight, a symbol of victory. He handed it to Maya, his voice booming across the crowd as he spoke. "No one's shutting this down," he said firmly. The crowd cheered in response, and Maya felt a rush of emotions: relief, pride, and a sense of accomplishment she never thought possible. The officer, Officer Daniels, had no idea what he was walking into. He had been avoiding the media, hoping that if he kept his head down, the storm would blow over. But the world didn't work like that. His actions, his treatment of Maya, had ignited a fire that couldn't be put out. And now, he was being forced to face the consequences. Daniels had arrived at the scene, but he wasn't ready for what he was about to see. The last thing he had expected was for Maya's lemonade stand to be back in full swing, this time with the support of one of the most recognizable names in the world of sports. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a retired basketball player, he was a giant in the world of entertainment, business, and philanthropy. And now, he was standing right next to Maya, making it clear that no one, not even the police, was going to stop her. As Daniels approached the stand, his face hardened, his jaw clenched. He had been told by his superiors to stay out of the situation, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He had done what he believed was his duty, and now, seeing this massive public display of support for Maya, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or frustration, but it was there, growing stronger with every step he took. Shaq saw him coming and stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the path. The crowd went silent in anticipation, their eyes on the two men standing face to face. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed. The air between them crackled with tension, as if the whole world was holding its breath. "You've done enough," Shaq said, his voice deep and commanding. He didn't raise it, but it was impossible to ignore the authority in his words. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for everyone who had watched the injustice unfold and had waited for someone to do something about it. Daniel stopped in his tracks, stunned. He had expected to walk up and assert his authority, but this was something entirely different. The crowd that had gathered wasn't just a group of curious onlookers, they were supporters, people who believed in Maya, people who believed in fairness and justice. And with Shaq standing there, blocking his path, Daniels realized he couldn't just walk over the situation. He couldn't pretend it didn't matter. For a long moment, Daniels stood there, his face flushed with confusion and embarrassment. He had never been confronted like this before, especially not by someone like Shaquille O'Neal. He had underestimated Maya, underestimated the situation. And now, in front of a crowd that had come to rally behind her, he realized the weight of his mistake. Shaq didn't move, didn't back down. The tension was palpable, and for a second, it felt like the world had come to a standstill. Then, as if on cue, the crowd erupted into cheers. The applause was deafening, a powerful show of support for Maya and a clear message that Officer Daniels' actions would not be tolerated. Daniels' face turned an even deeper shade of red. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. The shame was too much to bear. He knew he couldn't win this fight, not today, not like this. With his shoulders slumped, he turned and walked away, his head down, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. The crowd watched in silence for a moment, then exploded into cheers once again. Maya felt a weight lift off her shoulders, a relief she hadn't known she needed. Shaquille O'Neal turned to her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, Maya," he said softly, bending down so he could look her in the eye. "You showed the world what it means to stand up for what's right." Maya's heart swelled with emotion. She had never imagined that something as small as a lemonade stand could lead to this kind of victory. But here she was, surrounded by people who believed in her, standing beside one of the biggest names in sports, with the man who had tried to shut her down walking away in defeat. As the crowd celebrated, Maya felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She had taken on something much bigger than herself, and she had won. But she wasn't the only one who had won. Everyone who had supported her, everyone who had stood by her side, had won too. This wasn't just about one girl selling lemonade, this was about justice, fairness, and the courage to stand up against the wrongs in the world. The media coverage continued to flood in, but it wasn't just about Officer Daniels' misstep anymore. It was about the power of community, the strength of the underdog, and the change that could come when people were willing to fight for what they believed in. Maya had proven that one voice could spark a movement, and that was something the world would never forget. And as the day drew to a close, Maya stood by her lemonade stand, Shaq beside her, surrounded by the people who had made this victory possible. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the scene. For Maya, it felt like the beginning of something new, something big. She had learned that standing up for what was right, no matter how small you were, could change the world. As the final moments of the day began to unfold, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a dream. Just a few weeks ago, she had been a little girl with a simple dream, to sell lemonade on her street corner. It had been her idea, her little project to make a little extra money for school supplies. She had never imagined it would turn into a national story, a battle for justice, or a statement on the power of standing up for what you believed in. But as the crowd cheered, and the sound of applause continued to echo in her ears, she understood something deeper than ever before. This moment was bigger than just her lemonade stand. It was a symbol of what it meant to fight for your rights, no matter who you were. And standing beside her, Shaquille O'Neal, a towering figure who seemed larger than life, had made all the difference. She looked up at him and saw more than just a basketball legend. She saw a man who truly believed in standing up for what was right, who used his fame and influence to make a change. He didn't just post on social media. He took action. He made sure she had a voice, and he stood by her when it mattered most. "I couldn't have done it without you, Shaq," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of gratitude. "You're a hero." Shaq smiled down at her, the kind of smile that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. "You're the real hero, Maya," he said, his deep voice full of warmth. "You were brave enough to stand up. I just made sure people heard you." And that was the truth. Maya had been the one to face the injustice head on. She had been the one to endure the embarrassment, the ridicule, and the unfair treatment, and it was her courage that had started the ripple that would eventually become a wave. Shaq had just been the one to amplify that voice, to make sure the world knew what had happened and what was right. But even as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the scene, Maya knew that the fight wasn't over. Officer Daniels had walked away that day, but his actions hadn't been forgotten. People would remember the way he treated her, the way he had overstepped his authority and attempted to crush her spirit. The justice that had been served that day wasn't just about winning one battle, it was about ensuring that this kind of injustice never happened again. "Don't worry, Maya," Shaq said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is only the beginning. We're going to make sure your story gets out there, and that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else." Maya looked around at the crowd. Some of the neighbors had come out of their homes, some still unsure of what had been happening, but many of them now smiling and clapping, showing their support. It was a moment of collective triumph, a reminder that when people came together, they could make a difference. The power of the community was strong, and the lessons learned that day would ripple out far beyond the small town where this all began. As the evening wore on, the media cameras continued to flash, reporters interviewing witnesses and community members about the events of the day. Maya felt her heart race as she realized how much attention this moment had garnered. It was surreal. Her lemonade stand had gone from a small-time hobby to a national story, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. At that moment, Officer Daniels made his first public appearance since his retreat. The expression on his face was a mixture of anger, shame, and frustration. He knew his career in that town was probably over. His actions had sparked an outpouring of public support for Maya, and now, the community was rallying behind her in ways he couldn't have predicted. It wasn't just about his confrontation with a little girl anymore. It was about the way he had abused his power, the way he had chosen to enforce laws selectively, and the way he had let personal bias affect his job. Maya watched Daniels from a distance, the feeling of justice swelling in her chest. The officer may have thought he was doing his duty, but the truth was, he had made a grave error. He hadn't just targeted her lemonade stand, he had targeted the spirit of fairness that this country was built on. And now, the whole world was watching. The media started to dig deeper. Interviews with the community were being conducted, and it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. People began to share their own stories of injustice, small acts of discrimination that had been overlooked for years. Maya's story had become a catalyst for a larger movement, and she hadn't even realized it until now. Back at the lemonade stand, the crowd had begun to disperse, but the energy lingered. The town square was alive with chatter, with people discussing what had just happened, analyzing the events of the day, and speculating about what would come next. But for Maya, everything felt quieter now. She had already experienced the high of standing up for herself, of seeing the weight of justice come down on the person who had wronged her, and now, she was ready for the next step. The fight wasn't over. This was just one victory in a larger battle for fairness. Later that night, as Maya sat on the porch of her home, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the dark sky, she reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the people who had supported her, her family, her friends, the strangers who had come together to help her fight for her right to sell lemonade. And she thought about Shaquille O'Neal, the man who had become more than just a celebrity in her eyes. He had been a mentor, a friend, and a protector. But most of all, she thought about her own journey. The little girl who had simply wanted to sell lemonade had now become an icon of strength and resilience. She had become a symbol of hope for those who had been mistreated, for those whose voices had been ignored, for those who had been silenced by those in power. And as she thought about the next steps, about how to use her newfound voice for good, she smiled to herself. Maya knew that this was only the beginning. She had a platform now, and she wasn't going to waste it. The injustice she had faced had opened her eyes to a larger world, one that was filled with unfairness and inequality. But she was ready. Ready to speak out, ready to lead, and ready to make sure that no one would ever again be treated the way she had been. Shaq had been right, this was just the beginning. The next chapter in Maya's life was waiting, and she was ready to take it on with the same courage she had shown when she first set up her lemonade stand. She wasn't just a little girl selling lemonade anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the days passed after the dramatic events of that Saturday, the ripple effects of Maya's courage continued to spread far beyond her small town. What had started as a simple lemonade stand, a modest business venture for a young girl, had turned into a movement that caught the attention of people all over the country. Maya's story had ignited something deep within the hearts of so many, an unshakable belief that justice must always prevail and that no one should be treated unfairly, no matter their age, race, or background. Maya's lemonade stand quickly became a symbol of resilience. People from across the nation, inspired by her strength in the face of injustice, reached out to offer their support. Social media was filled with posts praising Maya's bravery. Hashtags like #MayaStrong and #LemonadeForJustice trended for days, as thousands shared her story, celebrating her courage and her ability to stand up for what was right. Some people even shared their own experiences of facing discrimination, drawing strength from Maya's example. What Maya had done in her small town had turned into a national movement for fairness and equality. It wasn't just words of encouragement pouring in. Donations flooded in to help Maya grow her lemonade business. People from all over the country wanted to support the young entrepreneur who had become a beacon of hope. Businesses offered to help her expand, while other local shops promised to carry her lemonade on their shelves. Maya was overwhelmed by the support she received. It was as if the whole world had wrapped its arms around her, and in a way, they had. But it wasn't just about making money. Maya had become a living example that you could stand up for yourself and make a difference, no matter your age or circumstances. Shaquille O'Neal, the man who had stepped in to support Maya when she needed it most, didn't just stop at helping her get her business back on track. He remained in contact with her, offering advice, mentorship, and making sure she had everything she needed to succeed. He even arranged for Maya to appear on a national talk show to share her story. It was clear that Shaq had become more than just a celebrity backing a cause. He had become Maya's friend and advocate. "I'm proud of you, Maya," Shaq told her during one of their many phone calls. "You did something a lot of people wouldn't have the guts to do. You showed the world what it means to stand up for yourself, and you're inspiring so many others. I'm here for you, and I'm going to make sure you get the help you need to grow your business. You've got a bright future ahead of you." Maya's heart swelled with gratitude. She had never imagined that her lemonade stand would lead to so many opportunities. She had always dreamed of making a small difference, but now she was making a big one. With Shaq's help, and with the support of the community, her business flourished. She expanded her product line to include different flavors, and she even opened a small stand in the local farmers market. People from around the town came to support her, eager to try the lemonade made by the girl who had taken on the world's unfairness and won. But as Maya's world grew brighter, Officer Daniels's world began to crumble. The investigation into his actions continued, and soon it became clear that his abuse of power wouldn't go unpunished. The community had rallied around Maya, and they made sure their voices were heard. People wrote letters, called their local representatives, and took to social media to demand that justice be served. The pressure mounted on the local police department. It wasn't just about the incident with Maya anymore, it was about the trust between the police and the community. Officer Daniels had crossed a line, and his actions had shown that he had been willing to misuse his authority to harm a young girl who was just trying to make a living. It became evident that such behavior could not be tolerated. The department conducted a thorough investigation, looking into Daniels's history of complaints and examining whether he had abused his power in the past. As the investigation unfolded, other stories came to light, stories of people who had felt mistreated by Officer Daniels, who had been targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with the law. It became clear that his behavior was part of a larger pattern. the community began to demand accountability, and they weren't going to let it slide. Eventually, the findings led to Officer Daniels's suspension. He was placed on administrative leave while an internal review determined his future with the department. It was a significant decision, one that showed the community that abuse of power wouldn't be ignored. The suspension was a clear signal that law enforcement officers must uphold justice, not enforce personal bias. For many in the town, this was the first real sense of justice being served. Officer Daniels had tried to crush Maya's spirit, but in the end, it was his own actions that led to his downfall. It wasn't just about the lemonade stand. It was about the way he had treated Maya and others like her with disregard and prejudice. By standing up for herself, Maya had become the spark that lit a fire of change, and Officer Daniels's suspension was just the beginning of that change. Maya didn't gloat about Daniels's punishment. She didn't take pleasure in his downfall. Instead, she focused on what mattered most: her lemonade business, her education, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She was still a 12-year-old girl with a lot to learn, but now, she knew the importance of standing up for herself and fighting for what was right. She had seen firsthand how the world could change when you refused to back down, and that lesson was one she would carry with her forever. In the months that followed, Maya's business continued to thrive. The town, once divided, began to heal. People who had once been hesitant to speak up now felt empowered, and many began to work together to make sure that injustice of any kind wouldn't go unnoticed again. The story of Maya's lemonade stand became a touchstone, a reminder that sometimes, even the smallest act of resistance could lead to big changes. And as for Maya, she continued to grow not just as a businesswoman, but as a person. She knew that she had a responsibility to use her voice to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She had become a leader, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. In the end, the lessons were clear. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but it will come. Standing up for what's right can be scary, but it's always worth it. No matter how small you are, you can make a difference. Maya's lemonade stand wasn't just a place to buy a drink, it was a place where fairness had been restored, where hope had been reignited, and where a young girl had learned that no dream was too big if you were brave enough to chase it. And as she watched the sunset over her town, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Maya Williams never imagined her lemonade stand would become more than just a way to make a little money. At first, it was just a simple dream, a way to put her entrepreneurial spirit into action. But in a matter of days, her stand became something much bigger, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. When Maya first set up her stand, she didn't expect much. She didn't expect anyone to notice her or her small booth by the side of the street. She didn't think anyone would care that she was just a 12-year-old girl trying to sell lemonade. But what Maya didn't know was that she was about to become the center of something far greater than herself, a movement for justice. Officer Daniels's actions had been cruel, unfair, and unjust. But what they also did was reveal the truth about Maya's strength. In the face of adversity, she didn't back down. She didn't give in to the pressure or let the injustice of the situation break her. Instead, she stood her ground. And in doing so, she showed the world what it means to fight for what's right, no matter the odds. Maya's stand wasn't just about lemonade. It was about standing up for herself, for fairness, and for the idea that no one should be treated unfairly just because of who they are. In that moment, Maya became more than just a girl selling drinks on a hot summer day. She became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what it looks like to fight back against injustice. But Maya didn't do it alone. She had support, from her friends, her family, and from people who believed in her even though they didn't know her personally. And one person, in particular, stood by her when she needed it most: Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq didn't just post a message of support online. He stepped in and made sure Maya got the help she needed to succeed. He used his influence and his voice to amplify hers. Together, They showed the world that even when the odds are stacked against you, you can still make a difference if you have the right support. And the support didn't stop there. The whole town rallied around Maya. Neighbors who once watched from their porches now stood by her side. Strangers reached out from across the country to show their solidarity. People from all walks of life came together, not just to support a young girl with a dream, but to support the idea that fairness and justice should be upheld, no matter who you are or where you come from. The aftermath of Maya's story was a reminder that sometimes, the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. A lemonade stand became the backdrop for a lesson in courage and perseverance. A simple act of standing up for what's right led to change, not just for Maya, but for the entire community. People began to realize that their voices mattered, that they could make a difference, and that injustice wouldn't go unchecked. Maya had ignited something in them, and that fire burned brighter than ever before. Maya's story shows us that we all have the power to stand up for what's right, even when the world tells us to stay quiet. We don't need to be famous or powerful to make a change. Maya was just a 12-year-old girl with a lemonade stand, but she had the strength to take on something much bigger. She proved that anyone, no matter their age or background, can make a difference if they're willing to fight for it. Her story also reminds us that the right support can turn a small dream into something incredible. Maya didn't have to face the injustice alone. She had the support of her family, her community, and even Shaquille O'Neal, who stood by her side when she needed help the most. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to make a difference, but when more people come together, that difference can become a powerful force for change. But Maya's journey didn't stop with the lemonade stand. It was just the beginning. She learned valuable lessons about standing up for herself, about the power of community, and about the importance of never giving up, no matter how difficult things might seem. Her experience showed her that even when life feels overwhelming, there's always a way forward. There's always a chance to fight for what's right, and there's always hope. Now, as Maya looks back on everything that happened, she knows that she has made a difference not just in her own life, but in the lives of many others. She has inspired countless people to take action, to speak up for themselves, and to fight for justice. Maya's story will be remembered, not for the lemonade she sold, but for the lesson she taught the world, that when you stand up for what's right, you can change everything. Sometimes, it feels like the world is too big for one person to make a difference. We might think that our voices don't matter or that our actions are too small to matter. But Maya's story proves that this isn't true. Even the smallest act of courage can lead to something bigger than we ever imagined. It can spark a change that spreads beyond us, touching lives we never thought we'd reach. So, what's the takeaway from Maya's story? It's simple: never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right. Never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. And never forget that even the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes. Maya's story isn't just about lemonade. It's about standing up against injustice, no matter how small it seems. It's about having the courage to speak out, even when it feels hard. It's about believing in yourself, even when others don't. And sometimes, the right support can turn a simple stand into a powerful movement. If there's one thing we can learn from Maya, it's that change starts with us. We have the power to make a difference, and it's never too late to start. Whether we're fighting for justice, equality, or simply standing up for what's right, we all have a part to play in creating a better world. Maya Williams showed us that. And if she can do it, so can we. So, the next time you see something that's not right, don't be afraid to speak up. The world might not change overnight, but if we all do our part, we can make a difference. After all, a simple lemonade stand can start a movement, and your voice can be the spark that changes the world.